All right. Howdy, everyone. Welcome to the first rendition of Democracy Notes Live. I am here with the one and only Randy Perez from Voting Rights Lab. Thrilled to have you here today.
Excited to be here. Thank you very much.
So today's Democracy Notes Live is a tale of two landscape scans. We each did a landscape scan in
We
the
did.
past few months, and we're here to compare notes. But first and foremost, I have to ask you, I'm legally bound to ask you, um, what's your side hustle? What's up with this DJ thing?
What's going on with the DJ stuff? Hi,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
everybody. My name is Randy Perez. I'm the program director at Voting Rights Lab. Gabe loves to talk about DJ stuff. But yeah, I am really excited to be here for the very first Democracy Notes live. We were trying to figure out, are we just going to yap? How are we going to do this? We do have a plan and we do have structure, believe it or not. But yeah, really excited to be here. And yes, I do DJ as well.
Love it, love it. So can you share a little bit of context, and I will do the same on
Mhm.
why Voting Rights
Yeah.
Lab did this landscape scan, who y'all talked to, what the process was.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hi everybody, welcome. Just for folks who aren't familiar with Voting Rights Lab, we are a national organization. We track election-related legislation in all 50 states on our Voting Rights Lab tracker. We do communications, research, policy analysis, trying to understand trends that are happening across the nation on really pressing and key and urgent democracy topics, from early voting to mail-in voting to post-election procedures. So we do a lot of that work, and our focus and belief is really that democracy is living or dying in the states, especially with where things are at politically right now. A lot of progress and a lot of challenges can happen in the states, and that's where our focus really lives. We, as an organization, have made it a practice to consistently be in deep relationship and be in deep touch with folks in the states that are doing this work day in and day out across multiple issue areas. And so we did a listening tour this past year in 2025, which was really a pivotal time to be in community with people. It was the first time that we had done a listening tour of the three that we have done over these years in person. We conducted in-person roundtables in 8 states. We did 17 roundtables. I was on the road. I racked up a lot of American Airlines miles
Wow.
that I now use for DJing. But we really spent a lot of time intentionally with people thinking about what are the big pressing challenges facing us, as well as what are the big opportunities, and tried to facilitate that conversation. And that's where our listening tour came from this year. We didn't set out with any sort of preconceived notions about what we were going to learn. We didn't have a set agenda. We were very open to being pushed. We were very open to new ideas. And I think that's what made it a really good space for our partners, new and old. And I think that's where the learnings that we brought together really came from too.
I love it. I love it. I love it. And so you did these 17 listening sessions. How
Mhm.
many people at each listening session? Who were
Yeah.
the people in the room there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for us, a big piece of this, and I know this came up in your report as well, is what is that definition of democracy and who really makes up this democracy movement? I think if you got to the core of each of our projects, that was really a big question that came up time and time again. It's kind of the classic, like, who am I? But it really is, who are we? Especially as things keep changing all around us. So we talked to 160 different organizations as part of this project. I would say on average, there were 8 to 12 people in each roundtable. They varied. We went to 8 different states for this project. And we also tried to go to places within those states that aren't traditional hubs. So, for instance, in Wisconsin, we didn't just go to Madison, Milwaukee. We wanted to have a rural perspective and went up to northwestern Wisconsin in Eau Claire. In Texas, we went to the border twice, west side in El Paso, east side in McAllen, and got very interesting perspectives to bring into this conversation. And I really did notice that, like, the definition of democracy and who we are consistently changed, or was variable at least,
Ooh.
place by place, person by person, formation by formation, which is both a amazing opportunity to bring in all kind of issue-based organizations. We had folks that do veterans organizing, reproductive justice, healthcare, climate. We had labor. We had all sorts of groups that are in this conversation that I think made it much more dynamic, but also much more challenging, of course, to really dissect because of the nature of the diversity of the partners.
Ooh. I'm so excited to dive in on the definitions of democracy,
Look how
definitions of
excited he
democracy
is. I know
stuff.
everyone's watching us yap, and
And
he just keeps getting more and more happy. So I'm glad
this
that
is
this is going well.
this is the best. And I wish I'd been a fly on the wall for all those conversations.
Sure.
And it would have been neat for us to do focus groups. That's a great idea for or sort of group discussions. That's a great idea for
Yeah.
next year's report on our end. Um, so for by way of background, Democracy Notes is a trade publication, which means a publication for a particular sector or field, and we're the trade publication for the democracy space. So we help people who are funders, practitioners, researchers, job seekers working on democracy in the US to stay up to speed on the field. And when was it? So October 7th through December 7th of last year, started this interview process where we interviewed 68 people. The team was myself, Masar Makati, Andrew Doty, and Samantha Owens. You'll hear from Samantha, Sam a little bit later in this. Uh, and we mainly talk to national folks. So we
Mhm.
talk to a lot of folks who were funders, heads of organizations, but whose organizations were either nationally focused or had national scope.
Sure.
Um, so I wish I had been a fly on the wall for your conversations, in
Very
part
same.
because we actually didn't talk to a lot of folks who are working at the state and local level.
Mhm.
Um, and I think the definitions of the democracy space and definitions of democracy itself that we heard are probably different in some ways from what you all heard.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, what did come up in
Yeah.
terms of definitions
No,
of democracy
absolutely.
work?
And I should say this too for timeline. We were doing these roundtables from the end of June through October of last
Cool.
year. So also what was interesting to me was there's like a piece about like vibes that comes up all the time. Is how the vibes would really ebb and flow during this period of time based on like major political events that were happening and how that could shape the conversation. Um, and I think for us, the way that we approach this definition of democracy question within these roundtables is we ask folks to write down and talk about what are the elements of a healthy functioning democracy that were most important to them. And we would get different answers again based on place and who was in the room. For some folks, democracy was this is the air that we breathe. This is the life that I live. This is the school that my kids go to. This is what's in my paycheck. For other people that we asked, we got a more I would say like academic or traditional definition of democracy that's defined a really large body of research around this about processes and institutions, et cetera. Some of that was place-based, some of that was race-based, some of that was class-based, some of that was just background-based. And trying to thread those needles was really, really fascinating. I know that came up in your report as well, of like this question about like, is democracy this power lines, right, that are kind of holding it all together and running things, or is it something that's more active and tactile and real? An example that I like to use of this is when I was in El Paso, Texas, and we did this. Participants were really, really insistent that economic justice was part of their definition of democracy. And this was a hypothetical exercise. So I asked them, I was like, okay, that's great. Like, let's put economic justice in your definition of what democracy means to you. I think that says a lot about the socioeconomic situation in El Paso
Mhm.
and why that was top of mind for folks that were in the room. But then I asked them, okay, how would that change your work? How would that change your messaging frame? How would that change your coalition and partnership dynamics? How would that change maybe your policy platform or campaigns that you were driving around issues? What would that really mean in practice? And we don't have a lot of time for that step back kind of
Mhm.
space to really think about the power of like what words and definitions are meaning in our campaigns because we're always running. I know a big part of your report too is like the rapid response that we're in. That came up for us all the time, the burnout. Um, that's kind of where that landed for us, and I'd be curious how that got landed for you guys too.
Yeah, so okay, a couple of the themes that resonated across the listening tours, the reports for me. Um, and as a disclaimer, this event is going to be more of a conversation about intersections between them, not a full rundown of everything that we heard, everything that we learned,
We could
democracy notes from
try.
the previous event. We can try, we can try. So check out the reports, check out our past event on the Democracy Notes report. Lots of stuff to dig into there. But a couple things that just came to mind as you were describing that. We have this trend, firefighters and construction workers. Uh,
Hmm.
we heard over and over in these interviews. Well, there's some folks who are working on rapid response. There's some folks who are working on a longer time horizon. There's some folks who are working on protecting marginalized communities, suing the administration, organizing groups. There's some folks who are working on building the next chapter of our democracy so that there's something to aspire to, whether that's electoral reform, participatory budgeting, etc. And that frame, just construction workers doing the longer term work, firefighters doing the shorter term work, has popped up a lot in our conversation since the report came out as something that folks have found useful in describing, oh, I'm in this lane. I'm glad that lane is over there, but I'm in this lane. Or our organization has a couple different parts to this.
Hmm.
Um, but one of the other things that that came through, I think, to some degree in both of our projects was people define democracy and the democracy space, like the ecosystem of organizations working on democracy, really differently. We
Hmm.
asked everyone in our interviews, how do you define the democracy space? Do you see yourself as part of it? And everyone's responses were a little bit different. We heard,
That sounds about
we,
right for us.
which, yeah, I mean, that's what you're going to get to some degree. We
Yeah, yeah,
heard
yeah.
polarities a bit. Like there's an institutional focused democracy space. There's a cultural focused democracy space. Um, there's a democracy space that's more focused on processes and a democracy space that's more focused on outcomes. And I think that's something I'd love to talk with you about because
Yeah,
one of the tensions that came through in the report was, you know, are is the democracy space just the power lines, like just rule of law, like just the basics of having a functioning electoral system, democracy, representative democracy, etc.?
hmm,
Or does the democracy space include folks who are like using the electricity, not just the power lines itself, but the folks who are using the system to affect the protection of rights for minority groups, etc.? And so
yeah,
when I when I hear about the folks who are in your sessions, it isn't just folks who are doing voting rights stuff.
sure.
And that's interesting, and that's different from the folks that we talk to and maybe how they conceptualize the democracy space.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of the crucial thing that comes down to not just what we learned in our reports and our assessments, but across the space of like who we are and where we're going, and if we're going to have successful outcomes. All the different things that you described of like the rapid response, the institutional work, the policy analysis, like the cultural work is so important too, the actual day in and day out organizing. All of that has to kind of work together. Otherwise, those pieces can't survive on their own. You can't have an institutions for a democracy that doesn't have active and engaged, educated people that are moving on it. Those people need to be able to use systems to actually express their power. And I think also people want to create feedback loops there. We're going to build stronger institutions, and the groups that you might have talked to who are doing those big, policy analysis of what the future could look like or have these like spaces for like long-term structural reform conversations without having the people in them who might be impacted by them, you're going to get a different outcome. I'm not saying they are or they aren't. I think you're just going to get different outcomes. And vice versa. There's so much that people can learn from in the States and that are doing organizing work from folks who have had the time to kind of and the privilege really to do that kind of big visioning space. And so I think when you bring those two things together, I remember when I saw that you were doing your report, I was like, oh, this is the perfect complement to what we're doing. And then when we started to analyze these things, we saw some of those overlaps start to emerge. And so I think the challenge and the call to the space from, for you guys who have such a great reach and such a great audience, and then for a group like us who has very unique partnerships and is working in the States, how do you bring those people together? We're never going to have one common definition of democracy. If you asked you and I off the cuff to define it, we would say different things, and that's okay. But how do you make sure that we at least have a shared language and are swimming in the same direction and are using the right tools together? And I think that's some kind of resource pieces that came up in your report too, the silos aspect. Everyone talks about silos, but silos can also be a choice, right? Like it wasn't easy for us to get some of these groups to engage with us. One, they might have been the first time they met with us, and we're asking them to do this kind of confidential assessment. So there's that component. And two, I remember hearing from some folks that did like organized labor and economic justice work. They were like, we're doing this democracy work day in and day out, organizing workers against business, all this kind of stuff. And it feels very different from how we traditionally hear democracy talked about, and we can't get that to our members. And so that next level of like, where are our volunteers? Where are our members? Where are our people? Versus where even some staff can make the assumption that they're at. That's when I've been humbled the most in my career, is when I spent too much time away from and then I have to be regrounded again.
Mm. Can you talk a little bit more about this trust gap, this
Sure.
disconnect between folks
Yeah.
working at the state and local level and folks working
Yeah.
nationally?
And there's something that came up in your report as well, I think, right? The kind of how to tread carefully, I think is the way that you guys
Yeah,
framed
yeah,
it
yeah,
too.
yeah.
And there's always the trust piece between, state and national. I remember when I was at like a state-based organization in Phoenix where I live, being like, oh, like you want to come here and do this and do that. I have a million questions for you, and I'm gonna like vet you to make sure. And we should continue to do that kind of work because we need to protect our communities and our space and kind of bring in good actors and good partnership. But it was really astounding to hear how much the trust gap, I think post 2024, people were in a state of shock, certainly for a variety of reasons, or had a million questions about what we are doing. I think everything was on the table for funders, for national organizations, for state-based organizations. And so people were asking really hard questions of each other, as they should. I think what it was exposing was one, the national democracy space often has a credibility problem with state-based organizations, whether it's seeming out of touch, whether it's moving at a different pace, whether it's different priorities. That's not true for every single organization, but we can always do better too as Voting Rights Lab. And that was actually something that we set out to do was how can we create a really good feedback loop, put all of our ideas and theories in front of these organizations and say, what do you think? We had like a new theory going into 2025 and we were like, what is the best way to get feedback on this like new idea that we have? Let's just put it in front of a bunch of really smart people. Some people hated it, some people loved it, people wanted to debate it, but we started a conversation that made our work better. And I think that's how you actually build really substantive trust with each other because it's impacting our work. There's so many resources that folks could be getting from each other and so much knowledge that could be shared. But when trust is low, you're just not going to ask that person. And I'd be curious how that landed for you guys too, and what the national perspective on that was.
Yeah, I mean, I heard a lot of skepticism. There, we interviewed a range of people. We heard a range of perspectives. Um, I heard a good deal of skepticism about whether groups working on economic mobility or housing or reproductive rights, et cetera, were part of the Big Tent or were part of the
Mm,
democracy space.
mm,
Um, and so I think it depends who you talk to in the national landscape, like whether they view the groups that you might have talked to as obvious, necessary allies, or folks who have a different theory of change, have different priorities, are maybe even detrimental to the work that some in the national democracy space are doing.
sure.
I wonder, I wonder what the next step is there to some degree
Yeah.
yeah, do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, I think. I mean, I'll speak from my personal experience. When I was at an organization in Arizona called Living United for Change in Arizona, or Lucha, and coming from a Lucha to a national organization, coming from an immigrant rights, economic justice organization, it was a challenge. I mean, it was a challenge to understand the space. It was so much bigger than I had understood working in Arizona, number one. So the scale of it was really challenging. And what I came to realize was two things. I did not understand what national organizations were doing, like in practice, because I hadn't worked at one, I hadn't lived through that, I hadn't spent time at that level, what the day in, day out looked like, what the resource allocations, what the priorities were, and where those push pulls were. And the same could be said for organizations in national organizations to states, right?
Mhm.
Like even I remember when I started that role, I remember trying to talk about democracy and things that were happening at the state legislature to our members who were and are so brilliant and impacted by these issues and are living through them day in and day out. And the way that I was talking about things was so academic and so up here. And
Mm,
I wasn't really meeting them where they were. And I couldn't move them to action the way that I wanted to. I couldn't have the impact the way that I wanted to. So what I would say is like until we start to really build communities of practice that are building that cross understanding, people
mm,
will ask in a post-election crisis were that to occur of some kind, where is everybody? Who's mobilizing? Well, are you in relationship with the groups that are building base across other issue areas that are always impacted by voting? Do they have the information that they need to successfully integrate and go? Some coalitions are doing an excellent job of that. Some coalitions we can do a lot more work together. So I think that also helps the trust too, and it helps with credibility too, because you can get into these kind of feedback loops in your head a little bit of like, oh, they're just doing policy over there, we're doing organizing. Oh, they're just doing like, organizing and base building over here. We're doing You put those things together, you have a winning campaign. And so I think we leave a lot of wins and resources on the field when we don't do that. And I think that it's up to people to take the lead in trying to facilitate some of that because those groups aren't going anywhere. right? And I think that if we work together, I think we can do some really cool stuff.
I totally agree. Um, that feels like a very natural segue to the Democracy Campaigns Workshop. Can you talk a little
Sure.
bit about Voting
Yeah.
Rights Lab next steps coming out of this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think something for us that I want to make sure folks understand is we really wanted to come out of this, and this goes to trust and credibility too, is we didn't want to just go to folks, extract information, and then be like, thank you. Like
Yep.
we really, especially for folks in states. I mean, I sat with people in these rooms who, were tracking what as their kids got home from school to make sure that like they didn't get picked up by ICE. Like people really gave us their time. And so we were really committed as an organization, as Voting Rights Lab, to make sure that we had actionable next steps coming out of this. So one of those things that we're super, super excited about is our Democracy Campaigns Workshop. And this goes to kind of all the different things that we've said on this kind of conversation so far. There's so many organizations that want to do more democracy work, might not have democracy-based training available, might not have a democracy-based staff person. It might not be a core focus for them, but they know that it's important. But they're in these coalition calls that are fast moving around legislation or raids on election offices or misinformation, political violence, elections commissions, all these things. And how do you create time and space for them to grow and develop in their leadership so that they can go forth and conquer in those spaces and really kick ass? And that's what the Democracy Campaigns Workshop is built to do. So we've just launched this program. We're really focused on organizations that might not traditionally be democracy groups, and thinking about how can we equip them with the knowledge, the skills to do that work. We just did our first one. It was focused on federal and state role in elections. And we spent time just digging into what that actually was in practice, both the law, the policy, and then facilitating a conversation about how is that showing up for you guys in your work? And then what are more resources that we as our team could create in collaboration with our other partners to actually facilitate and support your work? We're going to run scenarios. We're going to do a ton of different things in that space. And we're really, really excited about it. I want to see a new generation of diverse democracy leaders from across issues that challenge existing ways of thinking and help us pick up our feet, because they're the same ones that will be relied upon in the event of an election crisis.
Mm, I
Yeah.
love that. Um, there's another echo between our reports that ties to one of Voting Rights Lab's recommendations or next steps coming out of this.
But I love when
Um,
we're so aligned, dude.
it's
It's
so
great.
good. It's so good. So one of our trends was the elephant not in the room. We asked
Yes.
folks, and I think you might have also asked folks who's not in the
Yes.
democracy space but should be.
Hmm.
And one of the common responses that we got was right of center actors. Uh,
Hmm.
and there was nuance there. I mean, so uh, folks, some folks felt like obviously we need to be reaching across the aisle. We need to be mobilizing people who come from backgrounds that um, are right of center, come from communities that might not be showing up at in one of the organizing spaces that y'all are part of.
Hmm.
And other folks said the the right is too far gone in terms of authoritarianism. We're chasing a mirage. It's not
Sure.
worth going after. It's not worth our time or effort.
Hmm.
Um, I'd love to hear. And then at the same time, there are organizations in the democracy space that are doing uh, a really good job of engaging right of center actors
Yes.
already. So one that
Yeah.
came up, Future Caucus, they run coalitions, caucuses of state legislators, and one of their lessons learned was you have to have the representation on your team to be able to engage
Yes.
effectively with right of center communities.
Yes.
But how does that land with what you heard?
Yeah.
And what are y'all thinking on that?
Yeah, this was super interesting. I mean, so the way that we did this during the listening tour sessions was we asked like a very simple question. We said, tell us who is currently part of the pro-democracy movement, who is missing from the table, and
Yep.
then what it would take to move them from one to the other. That's actually how we landed on the campaigns workshop, was that kind of process. But one of those things that came up was about right of center actors and moderate and also moderates. I think how do you engage some of those folks? And I think this is one of the big kind of existential challenges and questions that the pro-democracy movement is facing that I'm sure you heard time and time again in your spaces is if we're in democratic backsliding or we have authoritarianism happening all around us, if we need a really big tent coalition to defeat that and fight back and kind of save what we have now and then be able to build something into the future, you're going to have to engage communities that you might not agree with on every single issue, especially if you think about it from the perspective of either legislative changes to democracy and voting rights policies. Also, the folks that are in charge of certifying elections, oftentimes in these counties where the threats are highest, oftentimes they do not share ideology with us on a variety of other issues, but might be able to be engaged by people that they do share that with who are also pro-democracy to get them to do the right thing. And so you can read more about this in our report, but we have been engaging with organizations that come from that more right of center or moderate space and thinking about how do you facilitate their coordination through a coalition? How do you facilitate equip them with calls to action, with new tools, with messaging, put them in media spaces, get them in contact with legislators or with election officials, et cetera, on these issues. And it was interesting to hear. I've been doing this work for, I have a lot of gray hairs that are coming. I've been doing this work for a while. And when I first did a listening tour for our team in 2021, and this kind of came up, people were like, no, 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 no. No, 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 we don't need that. Right. And that was part of the political space that we're in. We just had the Biden administration coming in. We're coming out of COVID. It was intense. It was hot. This was the first time that I in my career have heard that much openness, receptiveness, and need to the idea of bringing in new audiences, including moderate and center right partners. Because I think people see the moment that we're in, they want to survive it and they want to win it and they want to make sure it doesn't happen again. And that will take that kind of work. So I think you might have heard something very similar in your space.
Definitely, definitely. Also, just a reminder, we're going to be doing Q&A in just like a couple minutes here. So if you have questions, thoughts, reactions, whether you've read the reports or have not yet, feel free to drop those in the Q&A function and we will get to those. And I'm excited. We're going to be joined for the Q&A by Sam, Samantha, who's one of the co-authors, and we have, I think, both Andrew and Masara, who are the other co-authors on this event as well. So shout out to them.
Hmm.
And I wonder, one of the things that came up in our report was burnout.
Yes.
Well, I guess threats and burnout. We have two separate trends, one focused on
Yeah.
threats, one focused on burnout. On the threats front, the conversation was there are groups that are being targeted or will be targeted. And by groups, I mean in this context, organizations who we
Yes.
were talking to. Um, some of the folks that we interviewed, we have a quote in the report that was basically like, it's not if, but when the Trump administration comes after us.
Hmm.
Um, but there's a sense that threats will be unevenly distributed. Some folks will be more likely to be targeted than others. And there's a real sense of fear. A real sense of fear pervades the whole field. But one of the things that came through very strongly from interviewees was we don't want to be chilled in our work. We
Sure.
don't want the chilling effect of that fear to stop us from doing things that we know we should be doing or we think we should be doing. And then there was this sort of separate but perhaps related conversation around burnout. Uh, this has come through. Democracy Notes runs a peer learning cohort for chief operating officers of democracy organizations. The number one topic that they felt was most urgent was staff morale.
Mm.
Um, and so this is something that's popping up for us in a lot of ways, burnout.
Yeah.
Part of that, though, and I think this goes back to an interview that we did with you, Randy, actually, was
You
this
can't get
question
away
around
from me,
like,
dude.
is is what we're doing working? Like, there's this question
Sure.
around burnout tied to
Yeah,
morale,
yeah,
tied
yeah.
to effectiveness. Can
Yeah.
you riff on that a little bit? How did that come up in
Yeah.
your conversations?
Yeah. I think this is something I think every single person on this call has experienced burnout. I've experienced burnout, you experienced burnout, and we'll experience
Yeah.
burnout again. I mean, the work that we do and the things that we think about and the big kind of conversations that we have are hard. And I felt that in the room with my folks in my listening tour this past year. It was emotional, it was heavy. And that's a real challenge for the space. But I had never heard it described so consistently in the way that you just brought it up of like, does this matter?
Mhm.
And to have such an existential question from people who are running our campaigns of like, is the work I'm doing smart, impactful, and effective? And like, is it making any difference at all? to hear that from Houston to Eau Claire to Grand Rapids to Atlanta, like, it just was like, wow, we really feel like we are doing the same things and expecting a different result, and it is hurting our people. Um, and some of that are very complicated and beyond me dynamics around what's being funded, what's not, where there's capacity, where there's interest, election years, timelines, all these different pieces. But I think it speaks to there's a disconnect between people, the work that I think people want to do a lot of times, and the work that they're expected to do. Like the best organizers and the best groups in the country are the ones that are reactive, flexible, and responsive to the needs of their base in real time. That, they're always going to run their long-term issue campaigns about policy change, but they are going to be reactive to the needs of their base. So when food stamps are at risk or there's benefits that are on hold, they're going to do food banks and they're going to make that a major priority and pivot and take care of people. There's also a joy in that too. And so I think that burnout and there's also the threats to our organizations, but I do want to just quickly say, like, a lot of the threats that I see foundations or big national organizations facing a lot of times of like that scrutiny on like a national level, obviously having the executive in that kind of like prosecutorial role towards us and the attacks on law firms and everything else is really scary. But I can give you a dozen examples of state-based orgs that have gone through something very similar over these years on a micro scale, and that they were testing that, and now they're doing this. So I think that people have done a good job of kind of funding that work and supporting those groups. But as it gets closer to the election, I think those threats will ramp up. I think that political violence will get heated and more possible, especially with federal overreach into elections, which is a threat, just to name one of those that people are very concerned about and have been for a long time, but have also experienced before. I think people are seeing at scale a lot of things across the board that state folks have experienced before. And now we're all being forced to reckon with it, but the expertise on them is going to fundamentally be in the states because they've done it before.
Mm, I love that. Oh my gosh. All right, this is so rich. Want to
Hey,
bring
Sam.
in one of the co-authors from our report, Sam Samantha Owens. Um, Sam, are you there?
Yes,
Hey, what's up?
great. Hi. Great to be
Hello.
here. I am excited. We've gotten some great questions as you all have been chatting. So, I want to start since we were just talking about burnout. A great question that there's the person who asked this has a sense that very few organizations in the democracy slash civic renewal ecosystem are especially well funded. And they're curious if, in the course of your listening tours and just all the conversations that you both had, if you found a connection between burnout and folks working in this field just not being paid enough and not making enough to really sustain this work without worrying about making ends meet.
Ooh. Lots of thoughts on that to kick off. We have a quote in the report from an executive director that basically says, I'd be much less concerned about burnout on my team if we had been able to maintain our pre-election funding levels. So, and there's an element here of overwork that contributes to this. In terms of the funding landscape in the democracy space, at least among the national organizations that I'm more familiar with, my sense is there are a few that are really big and really well funded, like Protect Democracy, Campaign Legal Center, Public Citizen, a few others. Then there's a chunk that are maybe in the $3 to $13 million budget range. And then there's like a very long tail end of folks doing democracy work that are like sub 2 or 3 million in budget. And I know Democracy Notes wants to do more research into burnout and ideally some quantitative research where we'd be able to say, okay, these are the organizations where it's highest, or the types of organizations where it's highest. These are the types of roles where it's highest. Like maybe that's different across frontline organizer compared to development professional, compared to ED or CEO. Um, so curious to get some better data on that one. But anecdotally, we did have a question, or sorry, a quote in the report that tied to funding and burnout. But yeah, Randy, what popped up for y'all?
Yeah, I think a lot of that is true. I was saying comment in the chat about there are non-monetary ways of preventing and treating burnout. And I think that's true. I think like how do you support and create good culture at organizations is really important. How do you make sure folks are doing effective and impactful work? How do you create like good kind of systems to support staff during times of crisis or just in general? A lot of like nonprofits as they pop up, like some of those kind of structures and systems are somewhat antithetical to nonprofit spaces sometimes, and we need to do a better job of kind of creating that. I think on the funding side, one thing that I will name is there's obviously the cycles of funding and attention based on elections and things that are out of people's control. That will always kind of be the case. But I don't think people have a full understanding of just how stark those lean years can really be.
Mm,
I've seen organizations that might run like a $15 million C3, C4 budget in a presidential election year, and in the year following, they're like at 1.5 just to kind of cover operations and overhead, in addition to like shedding all the kind of staff and capacities that they brought on, and then they have to do it again. So there's also like, if you look at this from like a business perspective too, it's also like an inherently bad model and deeply inefficient. And you're like losing ROI by not keeping things kind of running as best you can. I see a lot of people that are taking on that challenge. I've seen like groups like Democracy Fund that are doing a really good job of pushing some of these learnings out, and that's changing. But that's something that we found a lot during the listening tour too, and I found in 2021 when I did this project as well.
mm,
Um, that is, I think that dovetails nicely into just thinking about trust. And a lot of what you both spoke about was the trust gap between different parts of the ecosystem and in particular state and local versus national. Someone in the chat or in Q&A said that they think part of the trust gap between national and local orgs might be a concern, might be rooted in a concern that from national orgs that local orgs would prioritize short-term policy preferences over the long-term health of democracy. So this idea of kind of short-term, long-term, either by advancing policies that do not align with the national field's democratic or institutional health goals, or by advancing policies on other issues through means that run counter to the national field's commitments and values. Does that feel consistent with what you heard, or any other thoughts on how we can bridge that gap?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't think I've heard that specific kind of analysis of that before. I think oftentimes some people think it's the opposite, right? Like I feel like a lot of state groups will be like national groups that are working on like big federal stuff might like prioritize some of these like really short-term fixes and not get the whole thing. Some of that's, the nature of how congressional work seems to go because of how broken it is. But I would also say like this goes to the definition of democracy and the trust and the shared language. Like to me, if you pass the package of like paid family medical leave and childcare like policies and support for people, that's a huge democracy win because we're taking care of people. If you did housing reform, that's a huge democracy win. And it's also more likely that you're going to build base of people around those issues than if you brought them in on like structural changes to election administration that we might need later. I think you have to do like material first and then get to structural pieces next to build that trust and change people's material conditions. So that's kind of how I think about that approach. Obviously, you want to do it all. Um, but I think that's some of the trust gap too, is like people are like, we need to make sure people can pay rent and change these like really big things. While you also, of course, want to do these big institutional fixes, but they don't seem as immediate to people because they're not experiencing them every day. I don't know what you think, Gabe, but
I have a follow-up question for you, which is I think half of the people listening will be like, yeah, totally, paid family leave, democracy issue. And half of the people listening will be like, how in the world is that a democracy issue?
sure.
Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes to the entire thing, right? So it's like when I think about democracy and what I heard from the listening tour is I think about people's power and their power to like material change their own lives in a positive direction. And I don't think that people can meaningfully participate in democracy if their material needs are not being met, that if they're not be able to survive. So if you're not able to like make sure that people have access to good childcare, good food, roof over their heads, and some of these basic pieces, and then we want to bring them in on like proportional representation or fusion voting or any of these things that, whatever your take on all these things are, they're very complicated, could be positive in the future. They're like, you want to start here, but I'm here and we need to move them here. I would have this same challenge when I was doing organizing here in Arizona of being like, we need to be really active on trying to stop this bad change to a cure policy. I remember this very distinctly being like, they were like, what's cure? Why do I care? What is this? Well, there's 30,000 ballots that could be thrown out. This could change the outcome of these, right? But then I started talking about it as power of people's votes being thrown out on the things that they were actually voting for, which oftentimes were paid family medical leave, healthcare, climate, student loans, whatever. And they started to click a little bit more. So that's where I come from on this. There's a lot of different schools of thought, but I think consistently I heard that from participants in the listening tour. I'm very
Um,
passionate about that.
I I love that. It came through. Your passion is coming through. Um, we have a few questions that are around just measurement, and I think thinking about you all talked about the different definitions of democracy, defining democracy work. Um, One question is, as there are these different definitions, how do we as a field, or how did the people you talk to go about um, measuring impact and success and traction on these kind of nebulous concepts? And then a follow up question from co author Andrew Doty is um, just like, how do you think about short versus long term approaches and success as we're thinking about measuring impact? Like, how are we kind of weighing those pieces?
Yeah. Gabe,
I would say on the measurement side,
this is a small question for you.
small question, small question. I
Keeping
what
you on
I'm
your
what I'm
toes today.
what's going through my brain is um some of I just wrote a concept note that includes uh doing field awards in the democracy space as a way to celebrate uh what organizations are doing. Like, what are the best comms campaigns? What are the best organizing campaigns? Who are the most effective operations professionals, fundraising professionals, etc.? And that strikes me as, in part, a way to change this narrative about our work being ineffective or there being questions about our work. Because, like, we are all doing things that we hope will change this very, very, very big challenge. And the way that we hope to see that change is sometimes out of the scope of our individual organizations. So, for instance, a lot of organizations saw President Trump get reelected or elected for a second time and said, wow, we lost. But those organizations were C3s that weren't actually working on electoral politics. I wonder if there are ways to either measure, track, communicate impact, and or celebrate wins that are genuine to successes that are happening, acknowledging the macro context is pretty rough, but that are genuine to wins that are happening within that macro context. And yes, I guess I would just say like, yeah, it seems like measurement is something that this ecosystem could get better at as long as it's done in a way that doesn't get in the way of doing the work. But yeah, Randy,
Yeah.
thoughts on
I would
that?
say I think it's incumbent upon each campaign and its kind of formation to create on the front end and define success together, the same way that's
Mm.
important to define what democracy is. So, for instance, there's all these coalitions across the country that are going to be critical right now in the post-election period to ensure that we do not have election results that are overturned, ballots that are thrown out, and are doing really great work to kind of defend what that looks like. How do you measure that? Like if there, I remember in 2024, because of the scale of victory for Trump, there really was no crisis at that level. The most prescient one was in North Carolina, and that was a real crisis, right? With having the Supreme Court race in North Carolina. You can measure the impact there of like being able to protect that election result. But like so much of what we do is in preparation for. So it's hard to kind of think about that. I would say coalitions and kind of formations need to figure that out for themselves on like each kind of individual basis because there's all these metrics about digital campaigns or comms reach or whatever that we all can kind of do. But I think if you asked like a state-based organization, like how do you measure success this year? They'll have their electoral goals, they'll have their voter registration goals, they'll do those things that they need to do. But has our base grown in their leadership? Do we have new leaders at the table? Are we doing new ways of thinking? Are we more prepared than before? And I think those things might be hard to describe and sell because they take time. Like an organizer might come into their role and not have a team for 6 months or a year of volunteers. It can take that kind of long and that patience. But at the end of the day, it's going to be organizers that you call upon in the events of an emergency. And so I think about it sometimes like that too.
We're getting uh, quite a few questions around just this, like uh, the big tent nature of it all and how to really build an expansive movement and ecosystem. Um, I want to start with one, which is to attract center and center right actors, there needs to be some degree of trust that the
Mhm.
democracy agenda is a civic container and not necessarily partisan or just kind of a Trojan horse for liberal or progressive agendas. Um, what has been the experience of your organizations or in the people you spoke to in trying to navigate that distinction? I know you all have talked about those different definitions of democracy, and is it just the power lines? And then something else I'd love for you all to respond that this person is asking is, can that distinction then alienate people on the left or center left while trying to gain traction with the right?
Yeah. I think this goes to how you set this up on the front end. You have to manage expectations and lanes very, very clearly. So I think actually like democracy defense work as it relates to the post-election period and certification is like one where you can really build a lot of alignment on of people not thinking that lawfully cast ballots should be thrown out and election results should be honored and overturned. And so you find what you can like start with and agree upon in principle, and then also the policies that would protect that. And you do that kind of work day in and day out to do that kind of mutual education and keep that conversation going. And you also don't approach it if you are coming from a more center left or moderate organization as if like you have all the answers. You might know nothing about this community.
Mm-hmm.
Like you just might not. And it's the same way that you would approach organizing a community on the left that you don't know anything about. I would also say I think something that the left has had to reckon with and I've had to reckon with is like our base sometimes is much more moderate than we think they are, to be honest. Like I think that kind of comes up a lot too, is that we're a little bit over here sometimes, and that we're kind of like dragging people. And the people kind of move back and forth based on what the politics of the moment can be too. I think for us, a great example through the Advancing Liberty Coalition, through Secure Democracy, is you know, we were able to build this alignment formation of groups that do veterans work, that do military family work, that work with Mormon communities, all these different people, and think about what are things that we really agree upon. And proof of citizenship was one of them, being opposed to these really draconian and harmful requirements. Now, as someone that comes from background that I do, I see that as an attack on like immigrant communities and all the racial tones of that. Now, to build a strategy that might defeat some of these proposals, you might need to approach that very differently with very different partners. And we need to be able to thread that conversation, but you have to have trust on each of these. And that is hard to balance, right? There's the emotions of it, there's the politics of it, there's the moment of it. Um, so I think we're all still figuring it out in real time, and there will be misses. But I think you have to set expectations of like, I don't expect these groups to come out on issues that are outside that lane. And I think we need to keep our expectations really clear and be willing to fight with our friends, right? Like, I might really agree with some of these groups on the proof of citizenship and not agree with them on some other stuff that I really care about. But we're working on this. Can you keep this focus? And that's an organizational and individual decision that everyone has to make strategically.
Mm-hmm.
I really like the managing expectations point that you made.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and just want to plus one the question itself. Like that feels like a very core tension that came
Yes.
up in our
Yeah.
landscape scan. And it feels like maybe the thing to try to figure out in the coming months and the coming years. So to be continued on that one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Um, the in this same vein, we've gotten a few questions just around, and I think we've talked about it, but just if there's anything else you want to add, just in terms of what some additional barriers are that you saw or that you see to expanding the pro democracy movement, and then where there are opportunities to
Yeah.
lower those barriers.
Yeah, I can go for it. I
Yeah.
think I think capacity is a major challenge. Like I said, if I had to look at the 160 folks that were in my listening tour spaces, how many of them were actually democracy specific staff was very low. Like they're coming in as like advocacy directors or policy folks that have a large portfolio. And so we don't often fund democracy specific roles at those non-traditional democracy orgs, right? But then we expect them to mobilize later or be a part of these fights. And that's a big challenge because I think when you do that, it changes the space fundamentally. And that's what the campaigns workshop is trying to do is bring those folks together and build that capacity. We're not a funder. But I think you really, really changed some stuff there. That's something that I heard time and time again of like, if we had a democracy person, we'd love to be here, right? Or I heard from like a union council president in Milwaukee being like, I would love to spend the time. I would love to have the capacity to dig into these things and how it's impacting my members. But that's not what we have here. So we're talking about these, again, high level certification, democracy concepts, but our folks are still here. I don't have the staff capacity or the resourcing to do this kind of bridge building. And that I know everyone's always like capacity funding, but I think in this specific scenario, if we had more democracy specific staffers at like very interesting organizations like labor, repro, et cetera, you really start to change that conversation because they have totally different perspectives on how to talk about this. And it's much more dynamic. I don't know,
I
Gabe, I
would
know you heard some stuff about this too.
no strong plus one. I would add infrastructure, field infrastructure, organizations to support the folks doing the work, whether that's supporting them with training, supporting them with wellness support, helping them be as effective as they possibly can be. Um, so I think this is a good place to end, given that we've gone well over our allotted time.
I'm
Uh,
shocked. I'm shocked that we just yapped away. Thank you all for
Shocked that
coming.
we yapped away.
Um,
Um, Thank you, Sam, for uh, moderating the Q&A.
Thank you.
Thank you, Randy, for participating. And oh, one question in the chat. When will we get to see Randy's DJing? Important
If you're
question.
attending South by Southwest in Austin, Texas, you will tomorrow night, actually. That's funny. That's what I'm here for.
I love it. I love it. I love it.
Thank you. That was going to
Awesome.
be my question.
Was it?
Wanted to make sure there was a DJ plug.
Essential. Essential.
Absolutely.
Essential.
Well, this was so great. I'm so grateful for folks for jumping on. Thank you to Democracy Notes for having us as Voting Rights Lab. I think these are really great reports. We're happy to engage more. There's more information about how to sign up, folks, for the Democracy Campaigns workshop that's linked in our report too. And just really, really grateful for the space. So thank you.
Love it. Love it. Love it. Thanks,
Awesome.
y'all.
Thank you. Have a good day.